So let's start by creating a new file. And we're going to call that file, and this is going to be a standard Swift file, not SwiftUI view or not Swift view. It's going to be called classes. Okay, inside classes, what I'm going to do, let's make sure everything's good over here. Does label work? If you're referring to using like the label for a, I honestly, truthfully, I missed at what point you had asked that. I'm not entirely sure at what point you were asking that. If you could just retype that question a little more specifically, we'll get into that. So let's talk about these classes here, okay? So inside these classes, I want to first of all import SwiftUI, okay? And just for everyone who's been joining up since, I wanted to show you guys what we're building. We are going to be building this right here, and this pie chart's not functional yet because, quite frankly, I was just creating a rough sketch of what we're building. But you can see that there are different clocks, and those different clocks, when I click them, I can start a timer for that clock, and that helps me track time for the different things I do throughout my day. And this pie chart obviously will be representative of your split up, okay? It wasn't worth building in advance. I just built the most of the core pieces in advance, and we can modify that as we go. So that's just a FYI what we're building. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a clock, okay? So I want to create a class called clock. And this clock, I want it to adhere to two different protocols. I want it to adhere to identifiable, and I want it to adhere to equatable. Now, what is the point of each of those? Well, whenever you're looping through, whenever you have a UI that is using the for each loop, and you want to, let's say, have 3 clocks and suddenly add a 4th one, for each is going to say, hey, you better be feeding us a list of identifiable or hashable objects. It actually gives a very specific message that doesn't say, oh, specifically identifiable or specifically hashable, but it'll say it needs to conform to blah, blah, blah. But regardless, as long as it conforms to identifiable or hashable, you can actually use it and add to that list, and the UI will update in real time. You'll understand what I mean when we get there. So to make sure that we adhere to these two different protocols, identifiable and equatable are what we call protocols, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here and say static. Well, actually, I don't even have to write it from scratch. The nice thing is I can come here and just say, hey, please variable called, second variable called name, var name. That'll be a string. And then I'll also have a var color. That'll be of type color. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and change gears just for a half second here, where what we need to do is create a second, we're going to have to create a second class. So we're going to go ahead and let this class sit here like this for a second. We have not finished with this class, but I'm going to create another class called time segment, okay? Now the purpose of this other class, time segment, is this clock will allow us to create a clock that we can track all of our time in and assign our segments of time throughout the day to a clock. So for instance, you can almost think of this clock idea as a task. So we're creating essentially task entities. The next thing we want to create is called what we'll call time segments. And these are going to be individual segments of time that when you click start timer and click stop timer, you create a segment. The next thing we'll do is assign that segment to a clock. And to figure out how much time you spent on a given clock or a given task, we'll just add up all the different time segments. So let's go ahead and create this class, and you'll see what I mean. And you might just be asking, why don't I just add up how much time I spent in here? Well, we're going to create a sophisticated time tracking app. And what I mean by that is, I want to know specifically the segments of time during which you were using this app. And the reason I want to know that is because later on I can show you at what time in the day you were doing things, instead of just saying, hey, you use this for 10 seconds. So we're creating something a little more sophisticated than just how long were you on this. So let's create this time segment class for a second. So time segment, I want to adhere to identifiable. Frankly, I make almost everything adhere to identifiable, and so far I haven't had a reason not to, okay? So just make sure everything's good in the chat. Oh, you use HStack with image and text. Could you use label instead? I haven't seen label used since UIKit. Right now, I'm just using the image. So text replaced label, at least from my understanding, when we moved from UIKit over to SwiftUI. Okay, so that's kind of why we're using text instead of UIKit. I'm sorry, text instead of label, because the label is kind of irrelevant now. Unless you're referring to the label that is associated with a button, and I understand what you're saying, but the reason I did it is because I always use my buttons the exact same way. Whenever I create a button, sorry, I'm answering the question from Nigel G. He asked me, I'm guessing he's asking why I used this version of a button from here to here instead of saying button. You can see the completions. It's not auto-completing, but one of the completions has a label. And my answer is I like to always make my buttons look exactly like this. So the reason I do it like this, it's just what I know, and I know it works, and I can put anything inside of a button. I could put a humongously complex view inside of this button area here, and it'll still act as a button. And that's why I use it the way I do. So let's go ahead and look back at time segment here. So time segment needs to be identifiable, and anything that is identifiable needs to have a var ID equals of type UUID. You can instantiate that UUID anytime or anywhere you want, but there has to be a variable called ID inside of your class that adheres to UUID, okay, or is of type UUID. The next thing I want to do is I want to create a new variable called start time, and that's going to be of type date. Then I'm going to create, and then I'll have var end time. That'll be of type date, optional, and it's going to be equal to nil. And that's because sometimes, in order for a time segment to have existed, well, you must have started it. But if it's the time segment you're on right now, there is technically no end time for it. And that's why we're making it optional. And we're giving it a default value of nil. Notice this is the first time we used equal to, and that's because this is the first one that we're giving a default value to. Then we have another one, var associated clock. And I'm going to make that of type UUID. I could make that of type clock and do a comparison. I could just say, oh, it's of type clock. And then say, oh, compare the UUIDs to make sure they're equal. But I just, for the sake of no reason, I just chose to do it this way. And I'm going to go ahead and continue with it until we find a reason to change it. It's a little less clunky. There's less stuff being passed around. So, actually, I do have a really good reason for why we're going to not do that. Because theoretically, we're going to add time segments inside of a clock. And if a component of a time segment is a clock, then we end up with redundant internal copies. So this is probably going to be the better way to do it. So now we're going to create an initializer. The first thing inside here will be an ID, UUID question mark. It's going to be equal to UUID. And well, we can go ahead. Actually, you know what? We don't need this to be a question mark. It's just going to be of type UUID, and it'll have a default value of UUID. We need to do that to get rid of that error. And you can, so that means that you can go ahead and give it, your own custom ID when you're initializing, or if you don't put anything, it has a default value of a brand new, fresh UUID. We have start time. That'll be of type date. End time. That'll be date equals nil. And associated clock of type UUID. Okay. And all we have to do inside here is just go ahead and say, we'll go and just say, oh, you know what I did? I did it like this. I know why I did it. I did it like this. Say question mark equals UUID. And we'll say if let ID equal ID. So if you actually put a value in there, we'll say self dot ID equals ID. Okay. Then else. And then we'll go ahead and just say, sorry, there we go. Keyboard's acting up, so we'll just come here and say else self.id equals UUID. And truthfully, we can probably just go ahead and do this. Okay. And then from there, sorry about that. There, we can go ahead and put the rest of the initializer in here. The next piece is very straightforward. Self.startTime equals start time. Okay, self.end time equals end time. And lastly, self.associated clock is going to be equal to associated clock. Okay. Nice and easy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish up this clock class really quickly. Inside the clock class, I wanted to have one other variable called time segments, and it's going to be an array of time segment. And it's by default going to have a value of nothing, aka a clock technically does not have time segments until you create its first one. Otherwise, you start having values for time segments that don't exist. You've never used a clock before. And the last piece we need to do in here inside of this clock is I need to initialize it, and you give it an initializer. And we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to say ID, UUID question mark. Looks pretty familiar. And then we'll have a name of type string and a color of type color. Okay. And inside the initializer, we're just going to go ahead and put a lot of the same junk in here. That's the same one. Yep. Self.name is going to be equal to name, and self.color will be equal to color. You'll have to forgive me for this keyboard acting the way it's acting. Okay, let's make sure we don't have any questions. Nope, everything looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and keep on going. That's that. So now our clock is ready to go. Okay, and now we have the time segment. Time segment now needs a couple more things. It needs a little more work. Okay, so time segment, I need to give a new function inside. Okay, time segment, I'm actually going to create a function called elapsed time, and we're going to put a variable that can be passed into it called date, or called ref time. It'll be of type date, and the output of this function is going to be an int. Okay, what is that? What does all that wording mean? It means I'm creating a function, I need to feed it a date, and the output of this function will return an integer. So I'm at the very end, I need to return some sort of integer. Now, I have a video that talks all about dates and time formatting and date formatting, and actually, I watched my own video to grab this information to make this video. So let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to do next. So you'll see that we created a parameter called reference time, or ref time. It'll be of type date, and it has one use. Typically, the elapsed time in this clock will be equal to the end time minus the start time. So if the end time is 5:30 and the start time was 5:20, then the elapsed time is 10 minutes. But in the case of the currently active segment, we have to use ref time as the end time. And the whole point of that is that if we're in the current segment, then end time will be equal to nil. End time doesn't actually have a value until we say, oh, all done. We're done with this time segment. They stop the timer, give it a finite value. Otherwise, we'll just use this function and feed it the current time right now to figure out how much time has elapsed for the most current active time segment or clock. So in here, what I'm going to do is we're going to call this let component diff. It's going to be equal to calendar.current.date components. Okay, and date components has a few different things it's expecting. First of all, it's going to be expecting a list of all the components you're looking for, and you'll see what those are in a moment. It's also going to be expecting a start time. We'll say from start time, and we'll say to end time. But of course, it's looking for a date for the from and the to, and this is an optional, so it's saying, hey, you're giving me an optional, and I'm expecting a finite one. We'll say, okay, fine. If there is no end time, aka this is the active segment, then what we'll do is we'll just feed you whatever ref time was fed in through the parameter up here, right here. Okay? Then we'll come up here. So what components are we looking for? We want to grab the calendar.component. Okay, and I want the day. I also want to grab the hour, and I also want to grab the minute, and I want to grab the second. So in short, what I'm saying is, hey, for the difference between these two times, I want you to be able to feed me how many days are in between, how many hours, how many minutes, and how many seconds. And if you want more information on that, you can watch that date video, but that is the skinny and frankly all you need to know. So let's go ahead and say this next part here. We're going to calculate how many, this function is expecting a return of int. And what int am I possibly going to be returning? I'm going to be returning how much time has elapsed from the end to the start, or from the start to the end, in the form of seconds. So I'm going to return, it's going to a variable called elapsed seconds. I like to work backwards, okay? So I'm going to create that variable called elapsed seconds. elapsed seconds is going to be equal to, you're probably saying, where the heck is he getting this? You'll see as we go. D plus H, H plus M plus S. Well, what's D, H, M, and S? That's the next piece. We'll say let S equal component diff dot second, and of course that is technically optional, so we're going to say if the seconds component is 0, then assume that, or if it's nil, then assume that there were no seconds. Okay, that's kind of silly, but it makes more sense once I start thinking about minutes. So now minute. So now what we're saying is, hey, m is going to be equal to the minutes in between, and hey, if minutes is nil, aka there are no minutes, maybe I started the timer and stopped it within 4 seconds, then minute will be 0. So give me a default value of 0. But in the case that minute was something bigger, then I need to pass that forward and multiply it by 60, because there's 60 seconds in a minute. So you'll start to see a trend. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come here and say hours. Okay, and then this right here, hour, that's going to be times 60, because there's 60 times 60 seconds in an hour. And then last one will be let day equal, or let D, sorry, equal. And you guessed it, I'm going to put that there, I'm going to multiply that by 24. And this one is going to say day. So now I can feed it the time difference between a start and an end, and I'm assuming that you're not going to start this timer and end it a week later. So looking at where we're at, we've now finished creating the clocks, okay? And I'll scroll through this, you can pause and make sure you guys have yours that looks just like mine. Okay, we have finished creating the clock and the time segment. Those are done. We probably won't touch those again, at least for a while. The next thing I need to create now is a new variable that I'm gonna call a global environment. So if you've worked with any of my projects in the past, you see that I love creating this global environment. I don't even remember where I saw this idea of creating a global environment. I mean, it's just an environment object, but all of my projects have global environment, and that stands for the environment object. So I need to create an observable object. Observable object needs to conform to observable object. And inside of here, I'm going to create a few different things. So for the sake of troubleshooting, I'm going to go ahead and create a published variable called clocks, and that is going to be a list of our first clocks. Okay, and that essentially what we're doing here is I'm creating this default list of 3 clocks here. Okay, that's what I'm working on right now. Okay. Oh, there we go. So I'm creating that default list of clocks, and I'm going to give it a value of 3 different clocks here. Okay, and the first clock is going to be a clock named work, and the color will be dark blue. Okay, and the next clock will be, or you can name them whatever you want. You can create however many you want. I'm just doing this for now. Orange. And the last one will be green. Okay, work, home, and school. All right, and then I'm going to create a few different variables as well. I'm going to create a published variable called active clock. It'll be an optional clock and with a default value of nil. All this is saying is this is going to be a variable called active clock, and publish means that I can see it anywhere. Let's go ahead and just say this thing has a default value of UUID. Okay, that will get rid of those errors. So I just went ahead and changed the initializer inside of the clock class. That gets rid of those. And the next thing I want to do is I'm going to create a published variable. Published variable called public timer. Okay, and that's going to be of type timer, and I'm going to give it a default value of timer. And last one will be a published variable called public date, and it'll be equal to date, default value. Okay, and if I scroll down just a little more, I'm going to create 2 functions in here. Okay, you'll understand where we use these functions a little bit later. So make sure this is timer. our first one is going to be activate clock. All right, and I'm going to need to pass a clock into it. Clock. Okay, so that's saying we're going to create a variable or a parameter called clock, and it's going to be of type clock. Okay, so you'll see this light blue is the class that we're referring to. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to say the first. So what is this function going to do first and foremost? You notice that when I click right here, I've activated a clock. It started, and when I click it again, we inactivate the clock. Okay. Or more complexly, if I click work and I start it, but then I go ahead and click home, what actually happens is I stop this clock and I start this one. So that's going to be the activate clock function, and of course the next thing will be an inactivate clock function, and you'll see how those come into play with each other. So first thing we need to do is we're going to say if let active clock equal self.activeClock, then do something. So all that's doing is we're unwrapping it. We're saying, hey, this is an optional, active clock is technically an optional clock, meaning that it could be nil. So the first thing we're checking is, hey, just make sure this isn't nil, okay? And then if it isn't, then I can refer to I can now say active clock. So you'll notice that before I did that, if I tried to say self.activeClock, oh, the autocomplete's not working. That's technically an optional clock. But as long as we're inside here, now active clock is no longer optional. That is definitely a clock object. That is not an optional clock. Okay, so expression of type clock, right? Whereas if I come here and say self.activeClock, you're going to get the same error, and it's going to say, hey, expression of type optional clock is not used. It's okay. It's the same principle. So active.clock. Make sure everything's still working on the stream. Okay. So, sorry about that. We're just going to make sure. And thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it. So, let's go ahead and say, hey, if let this clock index equal self.clocks.first index, and we'll say where. Then I'm just going to go ahead. Yours will probably autocomplete. I don't know why mine is not autocompleting, but I'm just going to roll with it, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and finish writing this code out, and it's going to say $0.ID is going to be equal to activeClock.id. Okay, what does this mean? We're saying, hey, I want you to search through all of the clocks inside of self.clocks, which, if you remember, is an array of clocks. We're saying, I want you to find the first index where the ID of the object is equal to active clock's ID. So we're searching through this list of clocks for this specific clock, okay? And we'll say, hey, when you find it, we're going to continue inside this loop. We'll say if self.clocks, and we'll say this clock index dot time segments dot last dot end time does not equal nil, then we'll do something. We'll say else, we'll do something else. Let's run through this expression. We're saying, hey, when you do this, once you find the index where the first one matches active clock, once you find the clock I'm looking for, I want you to go look at the time segments. I want you to find the last time segment in there, and if the end time of that last time segment is not equal to nil, well then something, you know what, I'm sorry, I messed up. We are going to use this, okay? I apologize. I pre-wrote some of this, and we're going to be using that in the inactivate. I had a feeling something was a little bit off. So all we need to do, I apologize, is right now we need to say self in this area, because we're activating clock. We just need to say self.clocks. We'll say this clock index dot time segments. Okay. Sorry, dot time segments dot append. We'll say new seg. Well, what's new seg? Nice and easy. We're going to come up here, and we're going to say self.activeClock is going to be equal to clock, and new seg is going to be equal to a new time segment object with a start time of date, which whenever you write date just like this, that means right now, the date right now. associated clock is going to be clock.id. So I apologize for the mix-up. Let's make sure we're all back on the same page, okay? All I'm saying right here is, first of all, if you're activating a clock, so if I'm going over here and I click on a clock, whoop, then I want to make sure that the new active clock is equal, that's public concept, this published active clock is equal to the clock I just clicked. And now I'm going to create a new segment, okay? And now I remember why I chose to do this. We're going to go into time segment, go to Initializer, and we're going to say it has a default value of UUID for that ID. All right, that'll get rid of that error. So now we're going to create a new time segment. That time segment is going to be, you'll see that it's going to be started with start time is right now, the minute you click on it, or the second you click on it. And then associated clock is going to be the clock that you clicked on. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go search through this, okay, and we're going to say, oh, find the clock I was looking for, grab it, and make sure you add this new segment onto the end of its list of time segments. So find the clock I'm looking for, find the index, and then go grab that clock, go find its time segments, and add this time segment to the end. Okay, that's what append means. Okay, let's go ahead and close that up. Activate clock, this should have said activate clock is a function. Active clock is a variable, okay? I'm going to go ahead and fold that up. And I'm going to create a new function here. And that's going to be inactivate clock. Okay? And I'm going to pass clock forward. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you guys can see a little better. And I need to pass clock forward. And I'm going to go ahead and write this code. Make sure we're doing good. All right, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to remember or to type them in. Don't forget. Okay? There we go. Just want to make sure we're doing good with streaming quality as well. So in the inactivate clock function, now in here, it's actually going to start out pretty darn similar. Okay, we're going to grab, remember this chain of if-lets? Okay, I'm going to grab that same chain of if-lets. I'm going to copy paste it. Don't reinvent the wheel. All right, and I'm going to put that right here. Same principle. Hey, I'm going to say, hey, look for that clock. I'm trying to inactivate a clock. It's the one I passed in as a parameter. Go find that clock for me. Okay. Boom, got rid of that. Now we'll say, this is what I was building earlier, we'll say if self.clocks. So what we need to do here is we need to say, hey, this time segment is over. So you need to go and put an end time on this. No longer do we have a nil end time, meaning this one, boom, locked, done. So this clock index, we're going to say if the time segments, if you go to the last one and the end time does not equal nil, then something is wrong. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just say print error. We should never end up in this portion of the if-then loop. Okay, you're trying to end a segment that already has an ending. Okay. We should literally never end up here. And the way we're going to architect this code should never let us get here. But I have it here so that if we ever need to know that we are here, this doesn't happen, okay? I should have said self.clocks. Okay? And otherwise, or else, if it is nil, meaning we are in the right place, then go ahead and self.clocks and this clock index dot time segments dot last dot end time is equal to date. Make sense? So we ideally will literally never end up here, but in case we are, we want to know. That's all we're doing here. What should happen is we should end up here. We'll say, hey, find that last item, and most likely, as long as we didn't screw up, end time should be nil because it's the currently active one because we have an activated clock. Go ahead and give it an end time of right now. Call it a day, right? And I'm going to fold that up. And now that we're done with all that junk, we'll come here and say self.activeClock will be equal to nil. All right? And I like to give myself little tidbits of information. I'm going to do a little print for the console. And frankly, I'm going to do some copy and pasting. All right? And say, hey, print that the ended time segment of the last active time segment is going to be this leading to that. So it's just showing us the start and stop time. And It was an optional string. Technically, I just like to put default values. This is all just for yourself. Okay, there's no reason you need to do this. This is just me troubleshooting. I like to have logs. Oh, you know what? Don't even worry about it. It's not worth it. Okay, forget about it. We'll just have 2 optionals. That's all we need to do for that. Okay, so inactivate clock and activate clock, those functions are done. Fold out that global environment. We are done with the classes file for now, okay? At least for a while.